I am honest to this House, I am true to this House, I believe in all members of this House, and I have tried to do what I thought was the right thing for all sides of this House. It is regrettable, and I apologise.
The public want to know how the suffering in the Middle East will end. What our politicians offered in the House of Commons this evening was mayhem and chaos. The angry scenes in the chamber leave the Speaker badly undermined and leave plenty of voters looking on aghast. Nick's been tracking the story.
I've been reporting from the Commons for 25 years and I've never seen scenes like these.
And what about the failure of Westminster to send a united message to Israel and Hamas? Does it help hostages still held by Hamas or Palestinians being killed in Gaza? We'll hear from the Shadow Defence Secretary, a former State Department advisor and a senior Israeli journalist. Also tonight, a month after a review into the Rochdale grooming scandal said girls were left at the mercy of paedophile gangs, one of the survivors speaks for the first time since it was published. Do you know how many times you were raped?
Most of the time I couldn't remember because I'd just be blackout drunk. I'd say possibly over 100.
And has the former chair of the Post Office turned whistleblower over something called UK government investments?
All my clients, without exception, are people who are extremely damaged and seriously injured by their experiences at the hands of the Post Office.
Good evening. It couldn't have been a more grave debate in the House of Commons today. One of the most serious issues of our time: how to end the fighting in Gaza. According to the Hamas-run Health Ministry, almost 30,000 Palestinians have been killed. Hamas still hold 134 hostages. Food is scarce in Gaza, and there's that looming IDF invasion of Rafah. Outside the House of Commons, protesters demanded British politicians call for an immediate ceasefire. Inside, an emotional Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, was apologising for his handling of what was supposed to be a day where the SNP led the debate, but ended with Tory and SNP politicians walking out of the chamber. There was chaos, confusion, MPs describing events as disgraceful and accusations of a stitch-up. We'll be looking at how the conflict might actually end shortly. But first, what on earth was going on in the supposed mother of all parliaments? Nick is here. Talk us through it then, Nick.
Well, Victoria, as I was saying, I've been reporting in Parliament for 25 years and I have never seen scenes like that. What we had was two parties in open revolt against the Commons Speaker, the government announcing that it was stepping away, not put its amendment to a vote, and that meant that the Labour amendment would go through. Now, it all really felt like it was falling apart just after 6 o'clock when Penny Mordaunt, who is the leader of the House of Commons, directly confronted the Speaker, although he wasn't in the chair at the time, and saying what you've done to break with precedent on your fundamental decision is wrong. And his decision was it was an SNP debate, so by convention you'd be voting on the SNP motion and then the government amendment to that, and the Speaker, we'll talk about this later, called a Labour amendment. And her fury was pretty clear.
It also appears from the advice of his clerk that the decision is taken against the long-standing and established processes and procedures of this House, and that the consequences may be that government is not able to respond to opposition day motions, and as such, the government does not have confidence that it will be able to vote on its own motion. For that reason, the government will play no further part in the decision this House takes on today's proceedings.
Now, the effect of that decision basically at that point made Labour the largest party in the House of Commons, so they were guaranteed to knock out the SNP motion. They were absolutely furious. There were a number of interventions by Stephen Flynn, who's the SNP leader at Westminster. Let's see what he had to say.
I'm afraid that that is treating myself and my colleagues in the Scottish National Party with complete and utter contempt. And I will take significant convincing that your position is not now intolerable.
So you can hear them shouting as SNP and Tory politicians walk out of the chamber.
Yeah, so Stephen Flynn led a walkout by the SNP contingent, and what was particularly interesting was that a significant number of Conservative MPs followed them. They are major political adversaries, but they had a common interest, a common agreement. They both thought the Speaker had made a terrible decision. Now, as I was saying, he wasn't in the chair. He wasn't meant to come back to the chair, but he did. And Lindsay Hoyle offered an apology, and it was pretty clear. I was sitting a few feet away from him. He was devastated.
I regret how it's ended up. It was not my intention. I wanted all to ensure they could express their views and all sides of the House could vote. As it was, in particular, the SNP were ultimately unable to vote on their proposition. I am, and I regret, with my sadness, that it's ended up on like that, in this position. That was never my intention for it to end up like this.
You could hear how emotional he was there. But why did it get to that point? Why did it happen?
It's because it all kicked off around about lunchtime when the Speaker made that announcement that he was going to break with convention and he was going to, on an SNP opposition day, call the Labour amendment. And that would have meant that what would have happened is the first vote would have been the Labour amendment. That would have fallen. The second vote would have been the SNP motion. That would have fallen. And then you'd have the vote on the government amendment, and that should have passed. Now, it all came about very messily. The Speaker was meeting Labour figures. There were a whole load of points of orders by Labour MPs after Prime Minister's questions. It was very clear that they were stalling for time. Now, the Speaker said that he did this for two principal reasons. The first reason was that he felt the three main parties had to be able to have a vote that they felt comfortable with. He said the rules date back to 1979, when it was basically two parties. There's many more parties now. The second reason he did it is he talked about how he was worried about the security of MPs. What that means is he's worried that there are a number of Labour MPs who could not vote for the SNP motion because it said things like Israel is guilty of the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, which is saying that Israel is in breach of international law. They couldn't vote for the government amendment because that doesn't go hard enough. It talks about humanitarian pauses. And he was worried, had he not made that intervention, there would be a significant number of Labour MPs not recording a vote for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, and they would, he feared, be hounded on social media.
Why does what happened in the Commons tonight matter when we step back and look at the big picture?
Well, obviously, it's not very edifying when you have this major conflict in the Middle East, and Parliament is having a wrangle over procedural matters. Not good for the reputation of Parliament. But it does raise questions about three principal figures. So firstly, the Speaker. Clearly this afternoon, he had lost the confidence of a substantial, potentially a majority of the House of Commons. That apology was accepted by Penny Mordaunt, so that suggests for the moment he's probably OK. It raises questions about Rishi Sunak. Why did he pull a vote? He has a huge majority in the House of Commons. He should have won that. There was a suggestion that there'd be a Conservative rebellion. Difficult to believe that he could have lost that vote. And then it raises questions about Keir Starmer, which I do have to say go right to the heart of the shadow cabinet, which is why did you require an SNP debate to clarify and get an agreed position on Labour's position on the Middle East? You get many more of these opposition day debates than the SNP. Why didn't you do this weeks ago, do it on your terms, and then you could have had a vote, not had to have worried about a contentious decision by the Speaker? I do have to say, the Labour view is they think that the SNP and the Conservatives had a joint interest in denying Labour MPs the ability to vote for the word ceasefire in a way that they could feel comfortable with.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you. Well, before we came on air, I spoke to Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey and put it to him that Labour had effectively brought the Speaker to his knees.
No, the House of Commons has really shown itself in the worst light this afternoon. We could have shown the British Parliament at its best, coming together to demand together an end to the fighting now, the hostages released now, more aid into Gaza now, and a ceasefire that can build into something that lasts and becomes a political process to get a two-state solution. But instead, we've shown the worst of Westminster, descending into a row-about procedure with a boycott by the Conservatives, a walkout from the SNP, and this has done nothing to help the cause of peace, nothing at all to help the Palestinians.
The Speaker was a man who commanded respect, widespread respect, across the House, and yet you Labour put him under such pressure that he made a decision, he told the House tonight, he regretted, and he apologised for it. He's now lost the confidence of some MPs in the Commons.
So that is totally untrue that he was put under pressure. That's been rejected by the Speaker, it's been rejected by Labour. He was trying to ensure, rightly, the widest possible debate. He is there to protect the interests of all MPs, and what he was trying to do was to ensure that the House of Commons had a vote on the three different propositions from the three main parties, and he was doing that because he knew that this matters to Parliament, it matters to our communities, and it matters to people around the world, what the British Parliament and the British government does to try and advance the cause of peace.
Surely the reason why we're actually here tonight in this position is to do with the central problem of Sir Keir Starmer's leadership. He hides. He could have tabled his own Opposition Day motion on a ceasefire. Why did it take the SNP doing it for you to get your act together with your own amendment?
Well, Keir Starmer and Labour have been arguing for a ceasefire for weeks now. We've been arguing for immediate release.
So why have you waited weeks then?
I'm going to answer your question. What has happened in recent days is that the threatened ground offensive by the Israelis against Rafah have become so serious, we've taken a stance to say that cannot happen. What's happened is that there's been a shift among important allies like New Zealand, Australia, Canada and others, demanding, as we have now, an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and one that can build into a long-term peace process. So that was the argument we were making today. An end to the fighting now, a ceasefire respected on both sides, and one that lasts. And today was an opportunity to debate that, to bring the House together. And I think as MPs, we lost sight of why we're here. We allowed ourselves to descend into the chaos of a row-about procedure, with the government boycotting their own vote and the SNP walking out on the debate based on their own motion.
But perhaps you, Labour, have lost sight of the fact that nearly 30,000 people have been killed in Gaza. What were you waiting for?
I am so concerned and aware of the agonies of the Palestinian people. The death toll is 30,000 and mounting, as you say.
So what were you waiting for?
Hospitals have been smashed, families are starving, yet more children are being killed.
Exactly.
And at this point, with the threatened ground offensive against Rafah, which cannot happen, now is the moment to take a stronger position, to say Hamas must release all the hostages, the Israelis cannot proceed with their offensive against Rafah, and the British government should come alongside allies to demand and call for and work for, as we have been doing, an immediate humanitarian ceasefire that can be respected on all sides and become the process that we need, a political process, a diplomatic process aimed at securing a long-term peace and security for Israel and for the Palestinian people.
At around 3 o'clock this afternoon, our political editor reported that senior Labour figures told him that the Speaker would need Labour votes to be re-elected as Speaker after the election, with strong indications this would not be forthcoming if the Speaker failed to call your Labour amendment. And Nick Watt interpreted that to mean that it would be the end of Sir Lindsay Hoyle as the Speaker in the next Parliament. What do you say to that?
Well, I've no idea about Nick Watt's sources. I've no idea about the interpretation he might place on those. But in a sense, you've stated the what happens. The Speaker is elected by all members of the House of Commons. He is there to protect the interests of all MPs, and part of that, and what he was trying to do, which backfired, and he apologised for this, but he was trying to ensure the widest possible debate. He is not there to do the government's bidding.
Are you saying that it is feasible that Sir Keir Starmer or a Labour MP or a Labour staffer might have said something to Sir Lindsay Hoyle that put a question mark over Labour support for him as Speaker in the next Parliament? If someone has said something of that nature to the Speaker, that would be unacceptable, wouldn't it?
Well, trying to pressure the House of Commons Speaker is hiding to nothing, I have to tell you. But the Speaker this afternoon made decisions about how to conduct the debate within rules that are outdated, heavily stacked in favour of the government, that do require review, as he said.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you. I'm going to pause you there because it feels like you're evading the question. If someone had said something of that nature to the Speaker about possible support for him in the next Parliament, if he did or didn't call the Labour amendment, that would be unacceptable, wouldn't it? Because that would be blackmail, surely.
There were three hypotheticals in your question. If all three were true, that would have been unacceptable. My point is, this afternoon, the Speaker set the terms of the debate because he wanted the widest possible debate. He was conscious this matters to Parliament. It matters beyond Parliament in our communities, and it matters what Britain has to say about the process of peace and how to end the fighting in Gaza.
How do you think this looks to voters tonight across this country, and also when it comes to sending a message to both Israel and Hamas?
This is dreadful. They were looking to Parliament for a debate that could give people hope that in the long run there can be peace, and in the immediate term there can be a ceasefire. This was the chance to show the British Parliament at its best. We've shown Westminster today at its worst.
Thank you very much for talking to Newsnight this evening and to our audience. Thank you, Mr. Healey.
Thank you.
Let's talk now to the SNP's Culture, Media and Sport spokesperson, John Nicholson. Thank you for being with us in the studio. Did SNP MPs walk out in anger alongside Tory MPs from the Chamber this evening?
Well, I think SNP MPs thought that the whole procedure was absurd. What SNP MPs did was they went to the lobby. That's the rooms beside the main parliamentary debating chamber, ready to vote. They were anticipating and expecting that there would be a vote. And I think SNP MPs, not just SNP MPs, but MPs across the chamber, wanted the chance to vote. A number of MPs cross-party said they wanted their constituents to know where they stood on this. And the problem with today's shenanigans was that MPs weren't allowed to express their views in the lobbies and to vote.
But they would have been. They would have been had the government and the SNP, your colleagues, not walked out, because under the Speaker's original ruling, the Labour motion, your motion, I beg your pardon,
yes,
would have
exactly.
been voted on. Your motion would have been voted on.
Eventually, and this
yes,
is a complicated way of...
let's not get into it.
No,
under the Speaker's original ruling, your motion would have been voted on.
Yes, eventually it would.
Yes.
But the problem was the government withdrew theirs first. But the problem about all of this is it's a smokescreen which has gone up to prevent us talking about what really matters, which is the people of Gaza and how to stop this slaughter. Now, we've been pursuing these arguments since November. As a journalist, I've filmed in Palestine for more than 20 years, including for the BBC. I wanted the chance to focus on that today.
But of course, nobody's been stopping you focusing on it.
But except the lead. The lead in your programme tonight isn't the substance. It isn't Gaza. Your discussion with your political editor was about the machinations in Parliament. That's
on many other
deeply
nights,
disappointing.
On many other nights we have led with what's going on in Gaza, and we will be talking about how to stop the suffering in Gaza.
Except tonight was tonight was a parliamentary day's debate that we'd chosen. The SNP doesn't get many of them, and we wanted to talk about the substantive issues, and I did today in Parliament.
Fair enough. Why did your colleague Stuart MacDonald at 1:45 tweet, why has the Speaker done this for Labour? Parliament and the country deserve an explanation. It looks grubby. The Speaker was simply wanting to give as wide options as possible to all MPs in the House. But what's wrong with that?
But that directly contradicts what your own political editor said earlier on today. Your own political editor said to you, Nick, that you've just been speaking to, said that senior Labour politicians had said to the Speaker, look, you either do something completely unprecedented or your days as a Speaker are over. And there's also rumours that he was told that, like his predecessor, he wouldn't get a seat in the House of Lords. Now, I loathe these shenanigans.
Well, you say that. You keep saying
but you keep asking me questions about them. And I want to talk about Gaza.
No, absolutely. But I just want to put to you, what you wanted today was Labour to only have two options. And the Speaker wanted the House of Commons to have as wide a range of options as possible. It was a device, say some, for you to embarrass Labour.
I wasn't remotely interested in embarrassing Labour. What I wanted Labour to do was to vote for a ceasefire. Labour refused to vote for a ceasefire in November, as you know. A number, 56, I think, Labour MPs voted with us. Every single MP who voted for a ceasefire in November was sacked by Sir Keir Starmer. We've now listened to something Orwellian today from David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, that Sir Keir and he have always been in favour of a ceasefire. Well, we know that's not the case because we heard what they had to say. Labour has had multiple opportunities to debate this issue on their own opposition days over the last 4 months. If they were so passionate about the arguments they're putting forward today, why did they not propose them in one of their days?
Thank you very much for being with us tonight and talking to our audience. John Nicholson from the SNP. Thank you. It's up for debate whether anything that happened in the Commons today will have any great effect on whether Israel will stop their offensive or indeed whether Hamas will release any more hostages. But when it comes to Israeli actions, America's influence is potentially quite different. In the past, presidents have called and with a single sentence halted Israeli bombs. Reagan, most famously in the 80s, and most recently Biden himself in 2021. So if the current president is indeed so concerned with the current suffering in Gaza, why is it not happening now? Let's talk to Laura Blumenfeld, who's a former senior policy advisor in the State Department's Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team. And in a moment, we'll hear from Anshul Pfeffer, who's a senior correspondent and columnist for the Israeli daily Haaretz. Good evening to both of you. First of all, Laura, does the US have the power to stop this? And if they do, why haven't they?
The magic word is security. Look, in 2021, Israel's existential security was not at risk. October 7th changed everything. I think that today Israelis feel and Americans feel like Israel has the right and the duty to defend itself. The question is, and Secretary of State Blinken put this at the very beginning of the conflict, he said, how you do this matters. And the United States has been pushing all along for Israel, yes, to prosecute the war, but to do it in a way that's morally defensible. Okay, so is part of it because it's election year as well, or not? Well, it's election year everywhere. It's election year in the United States, and absolutely, Biden is getting nipped at his heels. March is Super Tuesday, so yes, there's a certain March madness to it. But I don't think that's all. I think that Biden has a real commitment to Israel's security, and they feel like, the safe haven for Jews has turned into a slaughterhouse. And that real peace will come when Israel reachieves deterrence, right? Everything that Israel has accomplished over the years has been this kind of sheen of power. If they lose that, then remember, before October 7th, the United States was shooting for a regional alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia isn't going to want to have any kind of security pact with Israel if they prove themselves to be weak. So in the long run, I think they see this as an opportunity to create greater peace and greater regional integration. Mr. Pfeffer, if Joe Biden said stop and meant it, would Israel have to stop?
I'm not automatically. I don't think that it would necessarily happen immediately. And we saw just a couple of months ago, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was here in Israel and he was saying in closed rooms to Israeli leaders that the administration expects there to be a ceasefire by the new year. We're now, I think, already in late February, so 2 months later, and that hasn't happened. And yes, there is obviously a huge amount of influence to the American president has a huge influence here, unlike the House of Commons, when, believe me, nobody in Jerusalem or in Gaza is waiting to hear whether the speaker is going to resign or not. The idea that anything that's going to be said in London is going to have any influence here is just ridiculous. I mean, I've been watching what people have been saying now on your program, and it's just, I really don't understand how they think they can have any influence here. Britain has really no influence here. The Americans certainly do.
But remember, it's election year here as well. Why do you think Mr. Netanyahu and his cabinet can disregard Joe Biden when he says things like they've gone over the top or too many innocent civilians are being killed?
Well, as the other interviewee said, right now the Americans aren't pushing with full force on Israel too. They would like a ceasefire. They've got various things that they would like to do differently. But they also, I think, understand that this war is not going to end immediately. Israel has to continue its war against Hamas, and there's obviously the issue of the hostages. And I think what the Americans are doing now, and not just the Americans, is to choose a sort of middle course to try and reach a hostage agreement whereby some of the Israeli hostages can go free after being at 4.5 months in captivity in Gaza, and a temporary ceasefire for a start will be agreed upon for a month or so over Ramadan. And then after that month, they'll see if they can reach another agreement.
And finally, Laura Blumenfeld, this US temporary ceasefire resolution, I mean, is that serious, or is that some kind of diplomatic fudge?
It's Biden on a tightrope. He's all about balance, as your other speaker said. He's using a lot of double-barreled language to target two audiences. It's temporary ceasefire, temporary for the Israelis, ceasefire for the rest of the world. Secretary Blinken is talking about a pathway to two states. Again, pathway, because for the Israelis right now, they're deeply traumatized. They're not ready to accept two states. And for the rest of the world, including Saudi Arabia, we need to look toward that horizon. There's a lot of leverage that the United States could exercise. Militarily, they can slow down weapons transfers. The IDF is heavily dependent on the United States. Economically, there's a $50 billion bill to rebuild Gaza. Are they going to leave, the Israelis with the bill? Well, the Saudis will come on board. The Americans can use that leverage and say, but you have to acknowledge two states, and so forth. So it's just a matter of timing. I think we need some emotional intelligence in addition to diplomatic finesse to get to the right place today.
Thank you both very much for your contributions this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last month, a review into the Rochdale grooming scandal reported that girls had been left at the mercy of paedophile gangs after being let down by both the police and local council between 2004 and 2013. Those gangs were men largely of British Pakistani heritage, according to the Greater Manchester Force. The experiences of victims were front and centre of the report, but reading their words in black and white is no substitute for hearing from them. And it's rare to hear from them because they are scared still, traumatised still, broken still. I've been talking to one of those girls, now a young woman. From the age of 12, she was groomed, raped, made pregnant and sexually exploited. And it continued even after she was placed on a child protection plan by social services. She's been diagnosed with complex PTSD as a result of what happened to her. In her first interview since January's report was published, Ruby, not her real name to protect her identity, told me she was raped over 100 times in a period of 4 years. 100 times. Ruby explained how it began.
Nothing really happened that night. We just had a few drinks and then went home. And it was the same like that for a few weeks. Then one day we went in and there was like 30, 40 men sat there waiting for us.
30 to 40 men?
Yeah. They gave us a litre of vodka with no mixer and 10 fags. Said, go and sit down in the other room and drink that. Then they had another bottle of vodka inside the room. Then we sat and drank, and then it started. Then they took one of us, and then they took the other one of us, and then me, and it was like one in, one out.
And did you know what was happening was wrong?
Not at the start, but it was when When the rape started, then we knew, like, obviously this was wrong, but it had become like a taboo subject that we wouldn't speak about to each other about how wrong it was. We kind of just carried on.
Why do you think you just carried on?
We carried on because there were threats made. And then after that night, when it came out at the takeaway and then it was like into the streets, they'd get our numbers, they'd come to the schools, they'd come to near my house, they'd come everywhere and they'd look for us and find us. There was no way out.
They were vulnerable children, some as young as 13, plied with drink, raped and driven across.
Were targeted in honeypot locations where young people were seen to congregate, such as outside takeaways. Initially, they were made to feel special.
I feel like that obviously the first 5 times it affected me a lot, but then I feel like then I just become numb to it. Because obviously the first few weeks wasn't all doom, it was fun. We had drinks, we had a little party. We always thought at some point it was going to go back to that, back to being fun. Everybody knew.
What do you mean everybody knew?
I wasn't quiet about it. I told everybody.
What did you tell them?
I'm hanging around with older men and I'm getting drunk with older men. They knew.
You told teachers, did you?
Yeah.
And what did they do?
Fuck all.
Children were left at risk and abusers weren't apprehended. The failings were exposed by Maggie Oliver, a former detective with Greater Manchester Police who resigned over the force's handling of the abuse scandal, who now works with survivors.
The authorities were frightened of rattling that racial... they were frightened of being accused of being racist. So I think that made them tiptoe around this issue. I also, though, firmly believe that there was a judgment that these young children, who were often from difficult backgrounds, and that meant that they were the most vulnerable children, that nobody was going to cause a fuss about if the rapes weren't properly investigated.
How many years did these rapes go on for?
4 years.
And do you know how many times you were raped?
Most of the time I couldn't remember, because I'd just be blackout drunk. I'd say possibly over 100. Because there were men from all of the country. It wasn't just men in Rochdale. There was men from Bradford and Nelson and Birmingham, Blackpool. We went everywhere.
In the summer of 2008, you went to a sexual health clinic. Why?
We went for a cry for help because there was nobody else to help us. And obviously we told schools and social services knew what was happening. Again, nothing happened. So we went there, but we was given flavoured condoms and sent away.
Are you joking me?
No. We'd go in and the staff would be like, oh, we've got a new flavour condom. This one's strawberry, you need to try this. We're all 12 and 13. Why are you doing this? We told them exactly what was happening and they'd get excited over condoms.
According to the report published last month, the review into the Rochdale grooming scandal, you, quote, told them about older Asian boyfriends giving you vodka and sexually abusing you. As a result of that, Children's Social Care did a child protection assessment, and in October of 2008, you were put on a child protection plan under the categories of neglect and sexual abuse. Did that stop the sexual exploitation?
No, it did not stop it. They didn't really do much, to be honest. They didn't even speak about it to me. They never sat down and said, this is sexual abuse, this is the signs, this is what you need to look out for and all this. They'd come to the house, sit there, have a cup of tea, stand up and leave every week. And then that was it.
Why was it not taken seriously? Why was more not being done to protect you and to catch the abusers?
In 2010, I told a social worker, I gave him a list of around 60 men, phone numbers. I took him to addresses where abuse was happening to not just me, but all the other victims as well, and again, nothing was done.
These men were described together in court as callous, violent and vicious. They'll serve a total of 77 years in prison for the sexual exploitation of girls as young as 13.
The man who was abusing you was eventually arrested. Later, he was charged with sexual activity with a child under the age of 16 years. You were that child. He was not charged with rape. Why? Do you know why?
I don't know why, but I feel like it was because I weren't victim enough. I just feel like it's because I didn't cry and I was very numb and I was very, naive to the whole interviews and all that. I was very scared, but I didn't really show it in the right way.
Sexual activity with a child is a much easier charge to prosecute. You didn't have to prove anything. If they had charged him with rape, even though I think it is incredible to even consider this, the prosecution would have had to prove that she didn't consent.
So the man who'd groomed you into believing that you were his girlfriend, the man who'd got you pregnant at the age of 13, was found guilty of conspiracy, and he was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment for trafficking for sexual exploitation.
But he was out in 4.
How do you know he was out in 4?
I seen him in Asda. At first, I double looked because I didn't really believe what I'd seen. So then when it hit me like he's there, I kind of ran. I just went home and then obviously I didn't leave the house for 3 months. But again, he's still in Rochdale, he's still out and about, picking up his kids from school and living his best life.
Earlier this year, 9 men were jailed for sexually exploiting girls in Haywood, which is just on the outskirts of Rochdale. But that was long after one of the girls had given detailed complaints to the police and social workers.
What I want to ask you, Ruby, is it still happening?
It absolutely is. It's still happening.
Because of my role now as chair and founder of the Maggie Oliver Foundation, we are dealing with current cases all over the country. I still think that the police and social services are pretending that lessons have been learned, that things are better. And my job is to say, no, they are not.
If it's happening to somebody who sees your interview right now, what would you say to that girl?
I don't even know. I don't think the police are changed enough to direct them there. I was let down so much, I don't feel like I'd want another child to go through what I went through.
I mean, that is damning, isn't it? You're saying because of your experience and the horrific trauma you went through, you actually wouldn't say to a young girl today who's experiencing the same thing, contact the police.
I definitely wouldn't. Absolutely not.
How would you describe the effects of all this on your life?
Very damaging. Very, very damaging. I got complex PTSD now. I have a good life, but sometimes I don't sleep because it goes through my head. There's a lot of questions of why and what happened, why it wasn't dealt with right or whatever. The police should have dealt with it because it wasn't like it was a secret. I told everybody. I didn't hide it from anybody. And I just feel like I was let down.
And we have this statement from Rochdale Council. We are deeply sorry that the people who were at Rochdale Council during the period 2004 to 2013, like many other areas of the country, didn't recognise or acknowledge what was happening and failed to take the necessary action to protect children from abuse. Far more rigorous practices are in place today, and we're determined to ensure these terrible failures do not happen again. Greater Manchester Police said they continue to be deeply sorry for how they failed victims, adding, how we now prevent and respond to child sexual exploitation is vastly different, particularly in how we work with partner agencies to identify and safeguard vulnerable young people, relentlessly pursue criminals and care for victims. And if you want or need to talk to someone about similar experiences, then please do go to the BBC Action Line, where there are loads of charities and support organisations to help you. Next, the row between the former Post Office chair Henry Staunton and the government took another twist today as Mr Staunton released a note of a meeting in January 2023, which he claims showed that the former top civil servant at the business department, Sarah Munby, was asking him to delay compensation to postmasters to help ministers hobble to the next election. Tonight, Ms Munby has denied this is what she said or meant at that meeting. But Mr Staunton, in his Sunday Times interview at the weekend, also sought to blow the whistle on an organisation involved in this affair called UK Government Investments. Who are they? And what does he claim they've done? Here's Ben.
It's become a very personal war of words between the sacked Post Office chair, Henry Staunton, and the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch. And also today between Henry Staunton and the former Business Department Permanent Secretary, Sarah Munby. Very he said, she said. Yet is there something that's in danger of being overlooked here? Something more institutional than personal? Let's talk about the role of a body called UK Government Investments, or UKGI. This is a quango directly owned by the UK Treasury, charged with overseeing the government's stakes in commercial bodies such as NatWest and Channel 4. And that includes oversight of the publicly owned Post Office. A UKGI representative sits on the Post Office's board. In an interview at the weekend, Mr Staunton alleged UKGI was behind a letter written by Post Office CEO Nick Reed in January 2024 to the Lord Chancellor Alex Chalk, claiming that 300 of the prosecutions of postmasters were legally sound. Now, this letter is not yet in the public domain, but its existence has not been denied by either the government or the Post Office. And crucially, Mr Staunton argues UKGI were trying to influence the standing of postmasters in respect to compensation. In Mr Staunton's words to the Sunday Times, basically it was trying to undermine the exoneration argument. Newsnight also understands that Mr Staunton has concerns about the broader role of UKGI on the Post Office board. What's the wider significance of this? Well, given UKGI is controlled by the Treasury, it potentially implicates the Treasury, not just the Business Department, in this affair. Now, everything that Mr Staunton has said on record about UKGI is being very firmly denied by the body. Here's their statement. We strongly refute the claims levelled by Mr Staunton, both in the facts presented and the suggestions made as to UKGI's overall role. UKGI did not commission the letter, as Mr Staunton has claimed, and only became aware of it once it had been shared with ministers. It's not UKGI's role to set HMG policy on these issues, which is rightly the role of relevant departments. The Treasury declined to comment. Yet for some MPs, there remain questions about the role of UKGI, whose chief executive is Charles Donald, on the Post Office board.
Prior to this particular row breaking out, I did ask Charles Donald, who appeared before us, at what time and when, what papers he saw as a board member about the Post Office convictions being overturned, and he was quite vague in his answers. So at the end of the questioning, I asked him to send us a letter detailing that in much more detail than he'd been able to.
And let's not lose sight of the broader context. Postmasters still awaiting compensation.
All my clients, without exception, are people who are extremely damaged and seriously injured by the as a result of the consequence of their experiences at the hands of the Post Office. I think it's a very widespread experience that the payment of compensation is both slow and very limited when it comes.
Mr Staunton will give public testimony to Parliament's Business Committee next Tuesday, along with the Post Office CEO, Nick Reed. Expect the role of UKGI, this hitherto anonymous quango, to be very much in the spotlight.
Ben Shue. That's all from us tonight. Faisal is here tomorrow. Till then, good night.